Good morning. I'm James Bruin, and I am sitting in this morning for Ron Kernahan. It's a delight to be with you this morning. I'm the director of Faith at Work Network, and I'm one of the elders here at Brentview Baptist Church. This morning, I want to discuss with you a tale of two men, two older men whom in their old age faced some challenges in their life, and they responded to them very differently. My question for you is how do you respond to the challenges of life? So the first man I want to look at is King David. Let's turn with me, if you have a Bible handy, to Psalm 71. And there we will read David's encounter and challenges in the later years of his life. David wrote these words in Psalm 71. In you, Lord, I have taken refuge. Let me never be put to shame. In your righteousness, rescue me and deliver me. Turn your ear to me and save me. Be my rock of refuge, to which I can always go. Give the command to save me, for you are my rock and my fortress. Deliver me, my God, from the hand of the wicked, from the grasp of those who are evil and cruel. For you have been my hope, sovereign Lord, my confidence since my youth. From birth I have relied on you. You brought me forth from my mother's womb. I will ever praise you. I've become a sign to many. You are my strong refuge. My mouth is filled with your praise, declaring your splendor all day long. Do not cast me away when I am old. Do not forsake me when my strength is gone. For my enemies speak against me. Those who wait to kill me conspire together. They say God has forsaken him. Pursue him and seize him, for no one will rescue him. Is that the way you feel this morning? Do you feel like God is going to cast you away when you're old? That God will forsake you when your strength is gone? This is not the God we serve. David remembers that the Lord, and calls us to remember, that the Lord is our refuge. That God in his righteousness will rescue and deliver us. That God is our rock and our fortress. So what does it mean that God is our fortress? Well, when I think of a fortress, I think of a large stone castle where God is present. A fortress that we can go to at any time and wherever we are. It is a fortress, God our fortress, we can go to on Monday morning, on Tuesday morning, on Wednesday at noon, on Thursday evening, or on Sunday morning. Any day of the week, wherever we are, we can go into God's fortress. And God is there in his righteousness and will welcome us there. God's fortress is a place where we can go when we are feeling disoriented in life and get our lives reoriented around what is important, around what truly matters, and that is our relationship with God. God's fortress is a place where we can take the dreams that God gave us as a young man, and we can unpack them and unwrap them and look at them and say, Lord, when will you make this dream come true? And God will make your dreams come true in his own time and in his own way, in amazing ways. God's fortress is a place where we can be brutally honest about our feelings, about our frustration, where we can cry out, do not forsake me. And we remember this, God will never forsake you. But David says something else. He says in verse 1, in you, Lord, I have taken refuge. Let me never be put to shame. You can come into God's fortress. We can come into God's fortress and never feel that we will be put to shame. Doesn't matter what we have said. It doesn't matter what we have done. It doesn't matter what other people have said about us. We will never be put to shame when we come to God. Now, I said I was going to talk about two men today, but I'm going to very briefly talk about a third man. And his name is Peter. And if you recall Peter's story, it was the night that Jesus was betrayed. The night that the next day Jesus would be crucified. And that night, 3 times, Peter denied that he knew Jesus. I wonder what went through Peter's mind afterwards. Did he feel ashamed? Did he wonder if Jesus would ever talk to him again? And then the miracle happens. Jesus rises from the dead, and the tomb is empty. And as Jesus steps out of the tomb, he says to Mary, go and tell the disciples and Peter that I'm alive. That is the word that Jesus has for you this morning. Jesus is alive. But I wonder if that was enough for Peter. He saw the risen Jesus. He and the other disciples had meals with the risen Jesus, but was that enough? Because then Peter says to the disciples, I'm going fishing. I wondered that night when Peter went fishing if he still felt ashamed. If he wondered if it would be safe for him to come into God's fortress. And so he and the other disciples go fishing. And it doesn't go well. They don't catch any fish. I wonder if Peter felt like a failure. Not only as a failure that he denied Jesus, but as a failure as a fisherman. What was he going to do now? And then one of the other disciples spots somebody on the shore. And there's a fire there, and somebody standing there. And the man who is standing there yells out at them, cast your nets on the other side of the boat. And they try that reluctantly. And to their amazement, the nets fill up, and there are so many fish. And one of the disciples goes, that man on the shore, I think that's Jesus. And Peter runs out of the boat and runs across the water, and Jesus gives him a great big bear hug. And Peter starts to think, maybe everything is okay. Maybe God will welcome me into his fortress, and that I do not have to feel shame. But then Jesus says to Peter after breakfast, come, I need to talk to you. I wonder what went through Peter's mind at that moment. Did all the shame come bubbling back up in his heart and in his mind? Did he replay in that instant the things he had said that night when he denied Jesus? But Jesus doesn't shame him. Jesus will never shame you. Jesus will never shame me. Instead, Jesus invites Peter to feed his lambs. Jesus reminds Peter that he is the rock, that Peter is the rock upon which Jesus is going to build his church. Jesus reminds us today that we are welcome into his kingdom no matter what we have done. And Peter leaves that morning knowing that God will never put him to shame. It doesn't matter what he does in the future. It doesn't matter what he did that night when Jesus was betrayed. He is forgiven and he is welcomed into God's fortress. He is welcomed into God's kingdom. And so you and I do not ever need to be ashamed. You can come into God's kingdom, into God's presence, no matter what you have done. But notice something else in this passage. David cries out, deliver me, my God, from the hand of the wicked. He says, you are my rock of refuge. You are my rock and my fortress. Deliver me, my God, from the hand of the wicked, from the grasp of those who are evil and cruel. God's fortress is not just a fortress that is closed in, but God rides out from his fortress to deliver us, to rescue us. And in God's fortress, we can bring our current troubles, those people who are harassing us, the health problems that we are having, the other issues, the child who has wandered away, and we can leave them in the waiting room of God's fortress and say, God, you and your righteousness deal with them. Now, maybe there is somebody who 20 years ago in your career got the promotion that you thought you deserved. Or maybe there was a coworker who got credit for your work. Or you got unjustly fired because of what somebody had said. Or maybe many years ago, even before that, somebody said something to you. And you keep hearing those words and they make you feel knee-high to a grasshopper. So small. God says to you this morning, bring that person into the waiting room of my fortress and allow me and my righteousness to deal with them. And when you bring somebody into the waiting room of God's fortress, to allow God to deal with them, God will deal with them in his own way and in his own timing. God has said, vengeance is mine and I will repay. But there's great freedom when we bring somebody into God's fortress and allow God to deal with them in his own timing and in his own way. This frees us from having to deal with that situation or that person, which we were never created or called to do. This frees us to be the person we were meant to be, to go and do the things God created us to do. And it frees us, and we do not have to waste the emotional energy, the mental energy, the spiritual energy anymore, replaying what that person has done to us or plotting their demise. Leave that person in the waiting room of God's fortress to deal with. David goes on to say, you have been my hope, sovereign Lord. And that is the hope we have today in the present, that whatever our circumstances are, Our God is present with us, and God will deal with those circumstances. David says, you've been my confidence since my youth. From birth, I've relied on you. You brought me forth from my mother's womb. David learned as a young man that the people who were attacking him, he could leave in the waiting room of God's fortress. But what David discovered was that sometimes God deals with them quickly and gets rid of them, and they no longer harass him. This was the story of David and Goliath. It took one rock in a slingshot to go like this and to kill Goliath. And God delivered David and the people of Israel from the Philistines. But then later in David's life, still as a young man, Saul starts chasing him. And David says, I will leave Saul in God's waiting room. I will not slay the Lord's anointed. I will allow God to deal with Saul. Was that easy for David? Was David's life easy making that decision? No. But was David's heart changed? Yes. Was David at peace? Yes. When Saul wasn't chasing him and he wasn't running in fear, could David sleep at night? Yes. Because God was his fortress. God was his deliverer. And you can sleep at night when you leave the people and the circumstances that are chasing you in God's hand. You can have peace and joy in the middle of that. But before we go and look at what David does now in his older age, as his enemies surround him and say God has forsaken him, I want to look at another man. And this man's name is King Asa. And we find King Asa's story in 2 Chronicles chapters 14 to 16. 2 Chronicles chapter 14 starts out by describing how Asa, who is the king of Judah, starts by getting his spiritual house in order as a young man. We read that Asa did what was good and right in the eyes of the Lord. He removed the foreign altars and the high places. He smashed the sacred stones and cut down the Asherah poles. King Asa started as a young man to clean up his life spiritually. He got rid of the idols. Now today I know we don't have idols like altars and high places. But we all have things in our lives as young people that consume us, that can become more important than God. And for King Asa, the most important thing was God as a young man. And not only was God the most important thing as a young man, King Asa also was a wise steward of the resources God had given him. And so we read that during this time, while God gives him rest, and God gave King Asa rest during this time, partly because he had put his spiritual house in order. And so Asa says, let us build up the towns of Judah. Let us put walls around them with towers, gates, and bars. And then Asa goes on and he sets up an army of 300,000 men, equipped with large shields and spears. And so David is preparing for the future. Are you being a wise resource like King Asa was of the resources you have? Have you got your spiritual house in order? Because we live in a fallen and a broken world, and we don't know what will happen next. And then there are rumors of war. The Cushites are coming. I wonder what went through the minds of the people of Judah when they heard about the Cushites. Now, the Cushites were a large warrior tribe that was walking through the neighboring nations, conquering them, defeating them. I wonder what stories were told about what the Cushites did to the men and the armies of the nations they conquered. I wonder what stories the people of Judah heard about what the Cushites were doing to the women and children of the nations they conquered. Were the people of Judah trembling in fear? I suspect they were. But Asa, as a middle-aged man, faced these challenges the way we should face all challenges. He got on his knees and prayed. And I would suggest to you that as Asa brought his army out to attack the Cushites, and he looks over them and he realizes there's 1 million or over 1 million people in their army. There was only 300,000 people in King Asa's army. I suspect that some of the people in King Asa's army were going, this is a slaughter. The wives of some of those men were sure that they would never see their men come home again. But King Asa does what we should do when we face difficult circumstances. He stops and he prays. I would love to imagine that there was silence across the land. Even the birds stopped singing. Babies stopped crying. as King Asa's voice echoed across the land. And as he cries out to the Lord his God and says, Lord, there is no one like you to help the powerless against the mighty. Help us, Lord our God, for we rely on you. And in your name we have come against this vast army. Lord, you are our God. Do not let mere mortals prevail against you. And with those words, God came and struck down the Cushites. And that is what God will do for us today. When we cry out and say, Lord, there's no one like you to help the powerless against the mighty. That is who we find when we go into God's fortress, is that there is no one like our God. In God's fortress, when we run to God's fortress in times of trouble, we can cry out, help us, Lord our God, for we rely on you. And in your name, we go and face the challenges of life today. After Asa had been successful, because of the Lord's blessing on his life, after the Lord had delivered King Asa and Judah from the hands of the Cushites, a prophet comes to him and says to Asa, the Lord is with you when you are with him. And the Lord is with each of you who are listening to this morning. The Lord is with you when you are with him. If you seek him today, he will be found by you. But listen to the rest of the sentence. But if you forsake him, he will forsake you. Do you hear those words? If you forsake God, God will forsake you. Those are sad words. Do not let that be your legacy. So what was King Asa's legacy at the end of his life? Well, they lived for many years with peace. But then battle came again. But this time it was the Israelites. It was their sister nations. It was family. And Judah finds itself surrounded by Israel. There's no way out, we are told. And Israel is fortifying the ramifications around Judah so that Judah cannot escape. Now, what has happened here in this case is that what Israel did is they went to the king of Damascus and said, King of Damascus, if we give you $1 million, will you join us so that we can defeat Judah and other nations? And the king of Damascus goes, I like this. I'll take your money. Now, King Asa, being a very smart man, says, I'm a smart person, and I can deal with this situation on my own. I don't need God. So what does King Asa do? He calls up the king of Damascus and says, I'll give you $2 million if you will break your treaty with the king of Israel and will help me defeat the king of Israel. Now the king of Damascus goes, bonus, I got $1 million from the king of Israel, and now I get $2 million from the king of Judah. I've made $3 million. This is a great business transaction. So he takes the money from King Asa and the people of Judah. And where does this money come from? Scripture says this money came from the temple. This came from God's place. Do you see what King Asa is doing? He's using money that people had given to advance God's kingdom, to protect himself. King Asa is relying totally on his own strength. And it works. Israel, the king of Israel, sees that the king of Damascus is no longer supporting him. He realizes it's a losing battle, and he leaves Judah alone. King Asa's plans work. And you know what? When we do things without God, 9 times out of 10 it works. What do we need God for? What did King Asa need God for? Well, let me remind you what the prophet had said to Asa after God had defeated the Cushites for him. If you forsake God, God will forsake you. And another prophet comes to King Asa, and he says these words, because you relied on the king of Damascus and not on the Lord your God, the army of the king of Damascus has escaped from your hand. Wait a minute. Yes, King Asa was successful in his own terms, but he missed out on a miracle. If he had relied on God, what he is hearing from this prophet is not only would you have defeated the king of Israel, but you also would have defeated the king of Damascus, who had been one of your enemies. When we rely on our own strength, when we don't run into God's fortress, we miss out on God's miracles. We miss out on God's blessings. And yes, our God is still a miracle working God today. He can work miracles in your life today if you will allow him. The prophet goes on to say, were not the Cushites and the Libyans a mighty army with great numbers of chariots and horsemen? Yet when you relied on the Lord, he delivered them from your hand. Can you think back of a day when you relied on the Lord and you can see what the Lord did for you? Maybe the Lord provided miraculously for your family in an amazing way. Maybe the Lord brought healing in a way you didn't expect. Or maybe it was the job that you got that you'd been dreaming of and the Lord gave it to you. But now that you've been successful, how are you going to handle this situation that lies ahead of you? Will you trust in the Lord? And King Asa, and the prophet says to King Asa these words, for the eyes of the Lord range throughout the earth to strengthen those whose hearts are fully committed to him. Those are words of grace. Those are words of forgiveness. Remember, I said earlier, you will never be put to shame if you come to God's fortress. If you've been relying on God's strength for your life today, if you've been relying on your finances, on your own wisdom to get you through life, it's not too late to return to God's fortress. It's not too late to rely on God. For God's eyes are ranging throughout the earth to strengthen you, to strengthen me, to strengthen each of our hearts if we are fully committed to him. Are you fully committed to God? Or, as the prophet says very sadly to King Asa, you have done a foolish thing. When we rely on our own strength, we have done a foolish thing. When we don't run to God's fortress in the times of difficulty, we have done a foolish thing. But let me encourage you. There is another story. So what happens when we do run into God's fortress? What happens when we trust in God? Let's go back to David's story in Psalm 71. Let's see what he does when he hears that people are saying that God has forsaken him. When he hears people saying, pursue him, seize him, for no one will rescue him. Do you hear what David says in Psalm 71, starting at verse 12? He says, do not be far from me, my God. Come quickly to help me. May my accusers perish in shame. May those who want to harm me be covered with scorn and disgrace. You know, in God's fortress, when we come to God, we can be brutally honest. We can tell him our feelings. I love these words. May my accusers perish in shame. May those who want to harm me be covered with scorn and disgrace. And he expresses his feelings and he's vulnerable and honest with God. And why not? God already knows what his thoughts are. But then notice this change in his tone. He says, God, you deal with them. As for me, I will always have hope. I will praise you more and more. These men, these enemies want to destroy David. And David says, I have hope. I am going to go and praise the Lord. His situation may not have changed. We don't know what happens to the situation. We don't know what happens to the enemies. But David's heart has changed. He says, I will go and praise you more and more. My mouth will tell of your righteous deeds, of your saving acts all day long, though I know not how to relate to them all. I will come and proclaim your mighty acts, sovereign Lord. I will proclaim your righteous deeds and yours alone. By relying on God, by leaving these enemies for God to deal with, David is able to say, I will declare your righteous deeds, your marvelous deeds. This isn't David's story. This is the story of God. And each of us, each of you have a marvelous story of what God has done. And if you will trust God today with the circumstances of your life, you will have a marvelous story to tell of what God has done. And David says, even when I'm old and gray, do not forsake me, my God. And let me assure you, God will not forsake you in your old age. Do not forsake me, my God, David says, till I declare your power to the next generation, your mighty acts to all who will come. Do you hear David's words? Do you hear David's heart? David isn't bothered by these enemies anymore. That's not what is consuming David's energy. David wants to use his energy in these last years of his life for one thing. He wants to declare God's power to the next generation. He wants to declare God's mighty acts to all who will come. And that is God's invitation to you today. To those of us who have seen God do mighty things, he says, come to my fortress and trust in me again. And then go and tell the next generation the mighty deeds that I have done. These mighty deeds, these miracles that God works in your life, they're not for you. They're not for you to keep in your heart. They are for you to tell stories to the next generation. Will you go and declare God's righteousness reaches to the heavens, to the next generation? Will you tell the next generation that there is no other God like our God? Will you tell the next generation that when they see troubles, and that when those troubles, even if those troubles are many and bitter, that God will restore their life again? Will you walk alongside them and see God restore their life again? The greatest joy you could have in your life these days is to walk alongside somebody younger than yourself and see God restore their life and tell them stories of how God has restored your life so that they can have hope and the courage and the strength to run to God's fortress. David says, you will increase my honor and comfort me once more. God will give David the strength and the honor as the next generation listens to him and he tells stories of what God has done. David comes to God for deliverance so that he can praise God with the harp and tell stories of the faithfulness of his God, so that he can sing praise to the Lord, the Holy One of Israel. Imagine what this world would be like today if you and the next generation were singing praises to the Holy One of Israel instead of focusing on the negativity and the news sound bites that we hear all around us. David asked the Lord to deliver him so that his lips will shout for joy, that he will be able to sing praise to God who has delivered him. David says that my tongue will tell of your righteous acts all day long. Where will people find you today? Will they find you grumbling and complaining about your circumstances? Will they find you trusting in your own strength and getting out your credit card to find a solution to your problem? Or will they find you declaring the praises of God? Will they find you telling stories of God's righteousness today? Where will God's people, where will the people in your town, where will your family find you today? My prayer for each of you is that you would continue to grasp the length and the breadth and the height and the depth of God's love for you, and that then you would go, strengthened by God's love, to tell the next generation stories of God's righteousness for you.